This is Lecture 12, Latin America. To look at Latin America, well, it's a really large place. It starts at the border of Texas and Mexico and goes all the way down to Argentina and Chile, Tierra del Fuego, down at the very bottom. It's called Latin America because most of the people that live in this region speak a language that is based out of Latin, Spanish or Portuguese mainly. A little bit of French, some English, and some Indian languages also. But for the most part, Spanish and Portuguese. Looking at Mexico, Mexico's made of a lot of mountains, especially the central part of Mexico. There's some flat plains down in the southeastern corner, and just along the coastlines of the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. The same thing in Central America. A little bit of coastline on either side with mountains in the middle. In South America, we have one major mountain range, the Andes, which runs from far southern end of Argentina and Chile all the way up to Venezuela. You have two other ranges, which aren't really ranges, they're just high places. The Guiana Highlands and the Brazilian Highlands, which are just more elevated, not really as mountainous. The main river of this region is the Amazon River. And the Amazon actually is the largest river in the world by volume, by the amount of water that it puts out. And it's the second largest by length, by how long it is. But it is the largest by how much water it discharges. We also have the Caribbean Islands. In the Caribbean Islands, you have the Greater Antilles, which are the larger four islands, Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Then you have the Lesser Antilles, which those run from the Virgin Islands all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago. And if you want to include the Netherlands Antilles, you can. There's also the Bahamas, which really, I guess you could call them Lesser Antilles. They all are smaller islands, but they are kind of separate from the rest of the islands. When we look at the history of Latin America is very similar to the history of North America. It started out with lots of natives. There were large, very organized native groups throughout Latin America. The Aztecs live in what is today the modern heart of Mexico, where Mexico City is today. And Mexico City was actually built on top of the ancient Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. The Mayans lived in the far southeastern part of Mexico and part of what's today Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, and El Salvador. Then you have the Incas. The Incas actually lived in the Andes region. It was really weird because most civilizations that you find live in the plains, but the Incas actually lived in the mountains. Prior to 1492, these natives probably didn't have any contact with the outside world, at least for several hundred years. But in 1492, we know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. There he is. He was actually Italian, by the way. He wasn't Spanish. But he sailed for the King and Queen of Spain, who later became that. And he sailed off to the Bahamas. And later he ended up in parts of Cuba, part of Hispaniola. And he actually made contact with parts of South America and Central America. Never did he see North America. But he thought he landed in India, so he called them the Indies. After Columbus's exploration, and Columbus got back and told them, hey, I've found a new world, or found a new way to the world, other countries got involved. The English, the French, the Dutch, the Swedish got involved, the Danish. There were lots of countries from Europe that ended up coming across, but the major players were England, France, and the Netherlands, which are where the Dutch are from. From 1492 until about the early 1800s, the British Spanish, Portuguese, or whoever ruled the land of wherever in Latin America ruled the land. But starting in the very early 1800s, actually 1803, Haiti gets its independence. It kicks out the rulers who rule Haiti, the French there, and they claim their independence. They were inspired by the Americans. And in 1810, other countries like Mexico declare their independence. Now, Mexico gets involved in about a 10-year war for its independence, but by 1820, it became an independent country also. In the southern part of Latin America, you have men like Simón Bolívar and Bernardo O'Higgins, who were two of the main leaders of the Bolívar and O'Higgins are two of the main leaders of the independence movement in South America. And Spain, who was ruling South America at that time, or most of South America, was involved in a war with France. So they were busy doing that. And while they were doing that, Bolivar and O'Higgins decided to start an independence movement in Latin America. So they went through starting independence movements in Venezuela and Colombia and Chile and Argentina and Bolivia, which was actually named after Bolivar. In the process, they started these independence movements, and these countries started breaking away from Spain. And since Spain was occupied fighting France, they couldn't really send a whole lot of troops over to fight against the people of these countries. So eventually, Spain was defeated, and these countries by 1821 became independent, and they started developing their own history and their own identity as an independent country. Some real quick themes of Latin America. Number one is machismo, and this goes way, way, way back to early Spanish settlers. The earliest Spanish settlers were conquistadors. These men who were very brave, gallant fighters. We attribute them to something like knights, like the Knights of the Round Table of England. And this idea that the man is supposed to be strong and brave and mighty, and he's not taking any junk from anybody, that he's a hard drinker, that no one can tell him any different because he is the man. And that's what machismo is all about. It's all about being the man, and no one can tell you any different. No one can tell you you're wrong because you're a man. Besides this, there's also a distrust in officials. The Latin American culture in general does not fully trust their government or the people over them. And they have a right to do that because a lot of Latin American governments are corrupt, do have some backhanded deals going on. But Latin Americans in general believe family first. That is the first group of people that you take care of is your family. That includes your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, your cousins. They always come first before everyone else. A lot of people that move in Latin America move to other countries as immigrants for a better life. You find immigrants from Guatemala moving to the United States, and from Mexico to the United States. From Paraguay, they move to Argentina or Brazil. And they move there for better lives. One of the most popular sports in Latin America, hands down, is soccer. They eat, drink, and breathe soccer in Latin America. And two of the main soccer forces in Latin America today are Brazil and Argentina. Most people in Latin America speak either Spanish or Portuguese or a native language. When we look at Mexico, Mexico is typically very dry in the north. You think Arizona is right here, and Arizona is very dry. Well, that desert doesn't just stop at the border. It continues on. So all the way down to here is extremely dry in Mexico. When you get further down below Mexico City, it starts to get wetter. You get into some of these states like Michoacan, Oaxaca, Chiapas. You're starting to get almost into like a tropical rainforest. A lot of Mexicans end up crossing the border into the United States, trying to find a better life. If you notice that the immigration trends, if you know anything about them, a lot of the people from this side, the west coast of Mexico, end up going to California. When you get on the east coast of Mexico, those end up in Texas and into Louisiana, Mississippi. If you go to your restaurants, your Mexican restaurants, they usually serve shrimp. Well, that's because most of the waiters and most of the cooks and everybody are people from this area. Shrimp farming or shrimp raising, shrimp fishing is found all throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So you get a lot of restaurants from Veracruz that end up in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. They do some farming, especially corn. That's one of their big crops. They're very attached to their native roots, their Mayan roots, and a lot of things made in Mexico end up in the United States, especially in cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana.